Hello there and welcome to the Sleepy Alchemist. Tonight we drift into the pine-scented mists where a lantern sways on its hook and the air smells of wet moss and distant rain. Somewhere out there, in a forest that doesn't appear on any map you've seen, a man in a patched wool cloak is squinting at a pool of fog and muttering about treasure in the strangest place, blood. You probably want to know this because, let's be honest, we've all wondered what on earth medieval alchemists were thinking when they swore metal could come from boiling, burning, or otherwise bullying nature into coughing up secrets. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and I'd love it if you posted your location and local time in the comments. There's something magical about imagining this story whispered across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The alchemist trudged along a dirt track nearly swallowed by roots, his lantern's glow turning the fog into ribbons of gold and ghost. It wasn't treasure he sought, not exactly, but he believed that in each drop of blood shimmered a grain of gold, if only the right ritual could coax it into the world. A little out of step with history? Sure. Real medieval alchemists mostly obsessed over mercury, sulfur, and the mythical philosopher's stone, not tiny flecks of treasure in veins. But this one, whose name the forest never bothered to keep, was convinced he had discovered the shortcut to glory. The night breathed around him, damp and humming. Owls made their slow syllables. A fox paused, its fur tipped with dew. He thought about the first time he'd sliced his finger on a copper crucible, and stared in wonder at the bright red smear. Even then, he felt it was a message, a miniature library of the self. Historians still argue whether certain Renaissance alchemists truly believed bodily fluids were a key to transmutation, or if those rumors were later inventions to discredit them. Our traveler didn't care. His faith in the theory burned hotter than his lantern. In his satchel, clinking softly with each step, were glass vials, a little pewter funnel, and a small copper knife wrapped in linen. The knife's edge glinted whenever a gust lifted the fog. He muttered an inventory under his breath, a habit that kept loneliness from pressing too hard against his ribs. One of those quirky facts about the era: some forest alchemists really did wander away from urban guilds to practice alone, hoping secrecy would shield them from accusations of heresy. This one might have taken it too far. The village he'd last passed through had shooed him off with torches, convinced his nightly experiments soured milk and made dogs bark at shadows. Tonight, he was hunting for a proper place to begin. The pine forest leaned in close, branches dripping cold droplets onto his hood. He found a natural hollow where two leaning trunks formed an arch like the gate of some miniature cathedral. Moss cushioned the ground. Here, he decided, would be his workshop. He set the lantern on a stone, pulled his satchel around, and began the small ritual he always used to invite fortune. It wasn't much, just 3 taps of the knife's hilt on the earth, and a soft whisper that he hoped no night spirit found insulting. The forest seemed to lean back, granting permission. He struck flint to steel, coaxing a small fire to life, and the smoke rose in lazy ribbons. The damp air made the flames hiss like they were gossiping. He rolled his sleeves and held up a glass vial to the light, imagining it filled with liquid gold by morning. But before he even nicked his own skin, he felt the weight of the trees as though the forest were taking attendance. Something shuffled nearby, a badger, perhaps, or some other nocturnal skeptic. He laughed quietly, a sound that wavered between bravado and exhaustion. "If you can talk, now's the time," he said to the darkness, "because I'm about to prove the world's veins are gilded." His voice died quickly among the pines. He drew a single drop of blood from his fingertip, letting it fall onto the moss. The red was shockingly bright against the green, like a tiny banner. He held the lantern closer and thought he saw a shimmer, not golden exactly, but alive. The damp ground swallowed the drop, leaving a circle darker than the surrounding moss. A soft wind rose, curling the smoke of his fire in loops, and for a heartbeat he imagined whispers in it, as if the blood had opened a door. This was the beginning, though he didn't know it. Later he would swear he had heard the forest breathe his name. For now, he packed away the knife and simply watched the fog coil and uncoil through the lantern light. A man on the cusp of a discovery he barely understood. Somewhere in the night, A distant church bell tolled once, reminding him that even in this forgotten place, time was still passing, and he was utterly, blissfully alone. The crooked cabin revealed itself at dawn, half hidden under a curtain of ivy and the long shadows of pine. Our alchemist shuffled up the slope toward it, his boots squelching in the soft soil, shoulders damp from the night fog. He had seen it once before, years ago while following a deer track. Back then, it had seemed like the forest's own practical joke, a house leaning like it had dozed off mid-story, its chimney cracked and its shutters missing teeth. Now, with his lantern guttered and his satchel heavy with vials, he felt as if the cabin were a conspirator waiting with open arms. The door creaked like a question, but it didn't resist. Inside, the scent of wet wood and long extinguished smoke filled his nose. Dusty beams crisscrossed overhead, and somewhere in the corner, a drip of water plinked steadily into a forgotten bucket. A crooked table, a half-rotted chair, and the skeleton of a hearth offered the bare minimum for living and scheming. He set his satchel down, exhaled, and for the first time since leaving the village, let his shoulders sink. This place would be his laboratory, his copper dream, as he muttered to himself. Copper because all of his early tools were the humble reddish metal. Real medieval alchemists often began with copper vessels before aspiring to gold or silver, partly because copper conducted heat well, and partly because gold was, well, scarce and expensive. He ran his hand over the table, leaving trails in the dust. "Home," he whispered, as if naming it would seal the pact. He spent the morning scavenging the surrounding forest for anything useful: fallen branches for fuel, wide leaves for makeshift filters, and sticky pine resin to patch the holes in the roof. Once, he found a hunk of amber half buried in mud, warm to the touch like captured sunlight. He tucked it into his pocket as a charm, thinking, if the forest can trap ancient insects in honeyed stone, why shouldn't I trap gold in blood? By midday, smoke rose from the new fire in the hearth, curling through the crooked chimney and carrying the scent of resin and damp moss. He unpacked his glass vials, the pewter funnel, and a few lumps of salt and charcoal. Salt, he reminded himself, was one of the classical tria prima substances that real Renaissance alchemists like Paracelsus believed represented the body. Sulfur was the soul, mercury, the spirit. He lacked proper mercury, probably for the best, given how many alchemists poisoned themselves with the silvery liquid, but he hummed a tune and told himself that faith was the missing ingredient anyway. By evening, the cabin glowed like a lantern itself. Shadows stretched long and soft across the floor. He experimented with boiling water in a copper pan, imagining the steam as the breath of the forest mixing with his own. Into that steam, he whispered little promises. One fringe superstition of the era claimed that speaking intent over rising vapors could teach a substance what you wanted it to become. He wasn't sure whether it was science, magic, or just a way to stave off loneliness, but he talked to the boiling water as if it were a confidant. The first experiment was humble. He pricked his finger and let a drop of blood fall into the warm water, stirring it with a stripped pine twig. The liquid swirled pink for a moment, then faded to a faint rust tone. He leaned close, squinting for any gleam of gold. Nothing, only the scent of wet copper and smoke. He chuckled, the sound rough with exhaustion. "Historians would still argue whether I've lost my mind or just my patience," he murmured to himself, letting the steam bathe his face. Night returned with a suddenness that only deep forests know. He lit a stubby candle and watched its flame dance in the draughty room. He listened to the forest, the shifting creak of branches, the occasional plop of water sliding from leaf to leaf, and somewhere distant, a howl that could have been a wolf, or just the wind dragging its feet. He wrapped his cloak around his shoulders and began humming the same tune he'd used for the steam, as though it were a lullaby meant to settle not only him but the cabin itself. Before lying down on the floor with a bundle of leaves for a pillow, he took a final look at his tools lined up along the table. They looked absurdly small against the enormity of his ambition, yet he felt a pulse of contentment, the sort that comes from standing at the threshold of mystery. The forest might be watching, the village might be gossiping, but here, in this crooked cabin under a sky freckled with timid stars, he was the sole custodian of a secret that felt older than words. As he drifted into sleep, The candle sputtered, and in that moment between waking and dreaming, he thought he saw the amber in his pocket glow faintly, as if winking at the promise of discoveries yet to come. The morning mist hugged the forest like a patient ghost, curling around the crooked cabin and pressing cool fingers against the shutters. Our alchemist awoke with a crick in his neck and a pine cone stubbornly imprinted into his shoulder. He sat up slowly, listening to the soft drip of water from the roof into last night's bucket, and the faint, sleepy chatter of sparrows in the branches outside. The first order of business, naturally, was to check the copper pan on the table. The water had cooled to a murky rose-brown, and the single drop of his blood clung stubbornly to the edges like a shy guest refusing to leave. He squinted at it, half hoping that some miraculous glint of gold might appear, now that the liquid had rested overnight. Nothing. He exhaled through his nose and tapped the side of the pan. Lazy, he muttered to the water, as if it could hear him. Historically speaking, real medieval alchemists often began their day with patient observation rather than dramatic explosions. While modern movies love to show flasks bubbling neon green, the truth was mostly slow watches, careful notes, and an almost meditative silence. Some of them, like the 13th century scholar Albertus Magnus, even wrote that waiting was part of the spiritual training. Our alchemist, for all his impatience, felt the forest pressing that same lesson into his ribs. Breakfast consisted of a handful of nuts he'd scavenged and water that still tasted faintly of pine smoke. He chewed slowly, studying the dusty light, cutting through the window slat. Then he decided it was time to explore. If the forest truly guarded the secrets of blood and gold, he needed ingredients beyond his own veins. He wrapped his cloak tighter, tucked the amber charm into his pocket, and slipped into the trees. The forest in early daylight was a library of whispers, leaves brushing against one another, the tiny scratch of some animal tunneling under bark, and now and then the distant splash of water over stone. He followed that sound and found a stream, so clear he could see the shadows of fish flicking like rumours across the sandy bed. The alchemist crouched and dipped his hand into the frigid water. His fingers tingled immediately, and he imagined the current carrying a secret message into his skin. Water had always fascinated alchemists. To them, it wasn't just a drink, but a symbol of purification and change. One quirky fringe belief from the time claimed that spring water collected under a full moon could teach metals to grow like plants. He eyed the fish and thought, maybe they know more than I do. He rinsed out his copper pan, letting last night's failure swirl into the stream. Downstream, the water caught the weak sunlight and sparkled like a trail of broken mirrors. He couldn't help but imagine the forest itself smirking, as if amused by his stubborn pursuit. By midday, he had gathered a small trove, river stones veined with iron, bitter red berries, and a clutch of mushrooms with caps like tiny bronze helmets. He carried them back carefully, stepping over exposed roots and ducking beneath moss-laden branches. At one point, he paused near an old oak, running his fingers along the bark where strange symbols had been cut long ago. They were worn now, softened by time, but he recognized the faint outline of a circle with a line through it, a mark some villagers used to ward off wandering spirits. Historians still argue whether such carvings were meant for spirits of the dead or merely to scare off animals. Either way, he felt a shiver, imagining some long-gone hand cutting the same bark he touched now. He whispered, "I'm only borrowing the forest," and continued. Back at the cabin, he set up his new experiment. He crushed the iron-veined stones with the flat of his knife against another rock until his arms trembled, and the air smelled faintly of rust. Into the copper pan went the powder, a trickle of stream water, and 3 drops of his blood. This time, he decided to heat it slowly over the fire. Smoke coiled upward, carrying a metallic tang that mingled with the earthy sweetness of mushrooms drying nearby. He leaned over the mixture and talked to it the way a gardener talks to stubborn seedlings. "You know," he said to the bubbling pan, "gold has been in your heart all along. I just want to set it free." He could almost imagine the water listening, though perhaps that was just the smoke making him drowsy. Hours passed. Outside, the forest shifted from gentle sunlight to the muted greys of late afternoon. A jay scolded him from a branch, clearly unimpressed with his progress. He made a note on a scrap of bark with charcoal: iron dust, blood, stream water, heated slowly, smells like old nails. By the time night arrived, the mixture had reduced to a thin, dark sludge that clung to the bottom of the pan. He poked it with a stick, and for the briefest moment, the surface caught the firelight in a glimmer that almost looked golden. His heart leapt, then the glimmer faded, leaving only brown. He sat back, cross-legged, letting the disappointment settle into something almost comfortable. After all, failure was a kind of ritual here, like another log tossed on the hearth. The forest outside exhaled, and the crooked cabin creaked as if sighing in sympathy. Before sleeping, he tucked the iron-stained pan near the dying coals and whispered a promise to the night. "Tomorrow, I'll find the memory hidden in blood." His eyes closed, and the cabin drifted into that soft, timeless quiet, where even failures feel like lullabies. When the alchemist woke, the cabin smelled faintly of old iron and damp ash. The forest beyond the door hummed in that particular way only mornings manage, where birds test a few tentative notes, and the wind brushes its fingers through leaves still wet with dew. He stretched, bones creaking like the old beams above, and shuffled toward the pan he had left by the fire. The sludge within had dried to a cracked, rusty crust, and a thin ring of red traced the copper's edge. He tilted the pan in the light that trickled through the window slat. No gold, not even the whisper of it. Still, something caught his attention. The cracks formed delicate branching lines, like the veins in a leaf or the filigree of old maps. He traced them with his fingertip and wondered whether blood left stories even in failure. Stepping outside, he was met with the crisp air of late morning. Sunlight dappled the ground, catching on spiderwebs strung between the pines. Somewhere to his right, water gurgled over stones, a soft invitation. He decided that if the forest was truly to yield its secrets, he had to learn its paths better than its animals. He followed the sound of the stream, this time venturing farther along its bend, where the underbrush thinned and the water carved a shallow basin. Kneeling at the edge, he dipped his hands into the frigid current. It stung his skin awake. A school of tiny silver fish scattered, vanishing into the darker shade beneath a half-submerged log. People used to believe fish carried the memory of rivers, he said aloud to no one, recalling a tidbit from an old manuscript. Maybe they sit swimming through stories older than me. Nearby, a patch of pale yellow lichen clung to a boulder, crusty and dry despite the morning damp. He remembered reading once that some medieval herbalists ground certain lichens into powders, believing them to hold protective properties against wandering fevers. One particularly odd remedy involved mixing the powder into a poultice with honey, and he grimaced at the memory. Ground frog bones. Historians still argue whether these concoctions were sincerely medicinal or simply ritualistic gestures dressed up as cures. Either way, he plucked a piece of the lichen and tucked it into his satchel, feeling slightly conspiratorial. Further along the stream, he found a fallen branch whose core had rotted into a soft, spongy mess. Inside, he glimpsed a shimmer of movement, tiny beetles busily dismantling the old wood, each carrying its morsel like a jewel. He crouched, mesmerized, realizing this decay was the forest's own alchemy. Fire turns wood to ash, water returns stone to sand, and life finds a way to eat itself back into new life. When he returned to the cabin, he felt a different kind of energy, a hum that seemed to carry in his chest. He ground the lichen to a soft dust, added a pinch of river sand, and mixed it into a paste with a few drops of his blood. This time, he spread it across a thin piece of birch bark rather than the pan. He wanted to see if memory left a mark differently on wood than on metal. As the mixture dried, he noticed the forest shifting through the cabin's lone window. The light deepened to a more serious gold, and a breeze stirred the smell of pine sap. He thought about how ancient scholars had argued over the spirits of materials: sulfur for soul, mercury for mind, salt for body. If blood carried memory, he wondered, was it lending its story to the wood or stealing one in return? He left the birch bark by the window and sat cross-legged on the floor, chewing another meager lunch of nuts and berries. A beetle from the rotting branch had hitched a ride in his cloak, and now wandered across the floorboards like a black, living punctuation mark. He watched it patiently. Sleepiness crept into his limbs as the sun's warmth pooled in the little cabin. Sometime in the afternoon, a shadow moved across the window, not the flutter of leaves or the quick dash of a bird. This was taller, deliberate. He froze, heart tapping an uneasy rhythm. Slowly he rose and pushed the door open. The forest looked empty, but the breeze carried the smell of smoke that wasn't his own. He stepped outside, scanning the trees. To the left he noticed a wisp of grey curling between the pines, far enough to feel separate, close enough to feel watched. He hesitated, then whispered to the forest as if it were a neighbour leaning on the fence. "I know you're out there." Nothing replied but the ruffle of branches. That evening, when he checked the birch bark, the dried paste had cracked into patterns eerily similar to the lines in his palm. He held it close to the firelight, feeling a strange recognition, as if some part of the forest had written back to him. Whether that was memory speaking, or simply the wandering imagination of a solitary man, he wasn't sure. The night settled heavy and patient. Crickets began their faint metallic singing, and the forest sighed with a cool breath. He whispered to the drying birch bark, "If you hold a story, I'll learn to read it." And with that promise, he let sleep fold over him, the memory of the shadow by the stream gnawing softly at the edges of his dreams. Dawn slipped into the cabin like a quiet guest, touching the rafters with soft gold and prying the alchemist from his dreams. His eyes opened to the faint smell of damp wood and last night's embers, now only grey ghosts in the hearth. For a moment he stayed still, listening. The forest outside was almost too calm, the kind of hush that felt aware, as if the trees themselves were leaning in. The memory of yesterday's shadow by the stream returned in a cold ribbon down his spine. He rose, padded barefoot to the window, and scanned the tree line. No smoke now, no movement except a crow hopping along a branch, shaking off dew. He turned to the birch bark he had left on the table. Overnight, the mixture of blood, lichen, and sand had deepened in colour, from a rusty brown to a strange, muted crimson with a faint metallic sheen. More striking, the cracks had spread in looping, uneven arcs, forming shapes almost like letters, but not from any language he recognized. He felt a thrill run through him. "Memory writes itself," he murmured, voice rasped from sleep. He held the bark close, tilting it toward the early light, and swore the shapes seemed to shimmer just slightly when the sun touched them. He'd read once in a dusty treatise that certain medieval mystics believed writing itself was alive, that the shapes of letters carried breaths of the soul. Historians still argue whether that claim was metaphorical or literal in their minds, but he couldn't help thinking it felt literal now. Breakfast was a handful of acorns he had cracked the day before, and a single dried apple slice. As he chewed, he thought about the shadow in the forest. Solitude had its price. His cabin was not far from old trade paths. Occasionally, wanderers came through these woods, hunters or herbalists, and not all were friendly. He glanced at his small iron knife on the table, blunt from overuse. The day warmed quickly. He decided to venture farther than he had yet dared, following the stream upstream into denser forest. He carried his satchel with the birch bark inside, hoping to find new substances for his experiments. The air here was thick with resin, and the occasional sweet note of blooming ground ivy. His boots squelched in the soft earth, and somewhere far ahead, woodpeckers drummed their hollow music. He found a peculiar clearing around midday, a circle of stones half sunk into the ground, overgrown with moss. In the centre, a pool of stagnant water reflected the sky like a dull mirror. It reminded him of a tale he once read about scrying pools in medieval folklore, where alchemists and soothsayers claimed to read the past, present, and future in rippling surfaces. One eccentric monk from the 14th century swore that he had seen knights riding underwater like fish. Scholars still debate whether the poor man had been exaggerating or simply drinking his own tinctures. The alchemist crouched by the pool and dipped a fingertip into its surface. The water was warm, almost unpleasantly so, and carried the faint smell of iron. He scooped some into a clay vial, imagining the way blood's memory might mingle with water that had been sleeping among stones for decades. As he rose to leave, a sudden rustle snapped him alert. Across the clearing, between two beeches, someone or something moved. A flicker of brown cloth, a glint of metal. He froze, heart thudding, and waited. After a long moment, the forest stilled again. He exhaled slowly and retreated, taking a different route back, his senses stretched thin over every snap of twig. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun leaned westward, He set the vial of pool water on the table beside the birch bark. A wild thought came to him. What if the forest had been leaving him messages long before he noticed? The cracks, the patterns, even the shadows, maybe every element, water, wood, blood, carried pieces of old conversations. He mixed a few drops of the stagnant water with powdered oak ash, scraped from the edge of last night's fire. Then, with a deliberate cut across his fingertip, he let 2 drops of blood fall into the mixture. It fizzed faintly, then settled into a muted, dark paste. He spread it across another square of birch bark. As evening descended, he lit a single candle and watched the paste dry, breathing in the faint metallic scent. Outside, frogs croaked in the distance, and the wind whispered around the eaves. Sleep tugged at him, slow and heavy, but curiosity kept him awake. He thought about the warm, iron-scented pool, the flicker of a stranger, and the way the bark's cracks were forming small curls, almost like the tails of letters. Before bed, he whispered to the bark and the forest itself, "If you sit a speaking, I sit 'em still listening." The candle guttered. The night pressed close, and in its soft, patient darkness, the alchemist drifted toward dreams where the forest walked, and the blood in his veins hummed like a living archive. He woke to a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the usual chatter of forest birds or the distant splash of the stream. This was softer, like fabric brushing against wood. For a heartbeat, he thought it might be the wind teasing the shutters, but when he held his breath, the sound persisted. A faint shuffle, a careful step. Someone, or something, was moving just outside his cabin. He slid from the straw mattress and tiptoed to the door, pausing to let his ears adjust. The dawn light painted the room in pale silver, and he could smell the night's dampness clinging to the walls. He reached for the blunt iron knife, knowing it wouldn't help much against a determined intruder, but it felt better than empty hands. A shadow passed by the window. He froze. The shape was human, tall and stooped, but moving with an oddly patient gait. Slowly he cracked the door open. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure cloaked in brown. The hood was pulled low, and the hands were gloved. They weren't sit approaching, just standing still, like a carved idol among the ferns. The alchemist Sip's voice scraped out, "Who are you?" No answer, only the crow overhead giving a sharp, disapproving call. He thought about slamming the door and hiding, but his curiosity, always louder than his fear, urged him to step outside. The grass was wet, soaking the hem of his tunic. "Are you lost?" He tried again. The hooded figure tilted their head ever so slightly, then raised a gloved hand. In the palm lay a single small object, a piece of reddish stone, no larger than a walnut, with streaks of black running through it. He recognized it immediately: hematite. In medieval times, this iron-rich mineral was often called bloodstone because of its dark red streaks. Miners and healers claimed it could staunch wounds and draw iron from the blood, though historians still argue whether this was superstition or a primitive grasp of its high iron content. He reached out, hesitating, but the figure dropped the stone into the damp grass instead, then turned and walked silently into the forest. No sound of twigs breaking, no glance backward, just gone. The alchemist knelt and picked up the stone. It was cold, heavier than he expected. When he rubbed it with his thumb, the streak it left on his skin was a faint rust red like dried blood. His heart thumped with an electric mix of excitement and unease. Back inside the cabin, he placed the hematite beside the birch barks. The first square from 2 nights ago had now curled and cracked into a pattern, almost like a skeletal leaf. The second, coated with the pool water mixture, showed darker fissures that hinted at branching rivers. And now this stone, a gift, a warning, or an invitation. He ground a flake of the stone into powder with the base of a clay cup and mixed it with a drop of his blood. Instantly the mixture thickened, as if eager to congeal. He spread it on fresh bark and waited. Outside, the forest pulsed with life, bees buzzing somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drumming like an impatient visitor. As hours passed, the pattern emerged slowly, almost teasingly. This time, it resembled an eye, crude and asymmetrical but unmistakable. He stared at it until the candle guttered, and the forest shadows lengthened. Somewhere between fascination and dread, he remembered a curious note he once read about medieval alchemists. Some believed the forest itself could act as a living retort, turning their wandering thoughts into chemical messages. Historians still debate whether this belief was sincere or a metaphor for solitude driving a man to hear voices in wind and water. That night, lying in bed, he thought of the hooded figure. Perhaps the forest wasn't speaking on its own. Perhaps it had a mouthpiece now, walking on two legs, delivering bloodstones and silent stares. He whispered to the ceiling beams. I sipped, listening. I always will be. The woods outside seemed to murmur in reply, though it might have been the wind dragging its fingers through the high branches. Sleep took him like a tide, slow and insistent, while the faint scent of iron clung to the back of his tongue. Morning crept in without ceremony. The alchemist awoke to a milky light and a strange weight on his chest. Not fear this time, but the pressing sense that he had been chosen for something. He rolled onto his side, letting the chill of the earthen floor meet his bare feet, and tried to gather his thoughts. The bloodstone sat on the workbench, glinting with muted red, as if it had soaked in the first rays of dawn. His routine should have been simple: stoke the fire, grind herbs, boil water. But now each movement carried an undertow of expectation. He chewed a piece of dried pear, its leathery sweetness clinging to his teeth, and thought about the hooded figure. Perhaps a fellow alchemist? Perhaps a hermit from the far side of the forest, where the ground dipped into old Roman ruins. He could imagine some weathered man or woman reading his experiments from afar, leaving silent instructions through gifts of stone. By midday, he carried the hematite to the stream. The water was colder than yesterday, carrying a metallic tang that made him wonder if iron seeped from hidden veins under the soil. He remembered a fragment from a medieval manuscript he once smuggled out of a library. Some alchemists believed streams fed by iron-rich springs could carry the memories of the earth, transferring them to anyone who dared drink. Historians still argue whether this was spiritual metaphor or a misreading of the health effects of mineral water. He dipped the stone, letting the current wash over it. Ripples bent sunlight into shards, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw letters forming on the surface, tiny, fleeting, unreadable. He blinked, and they were gone. Returning to his cabin, he decided to attempt something reckless, combining blood, bark, and now flowing water in one experiment. He pricked his thumb, letting a drop fall into the cup. The red swirled in lazy tendrils like smoke underwater. He added a pinch of hematite powder and a sliver of wet birch bark. Steam rose faintly, even though the mixture wasn't hot. When he brushed the concoction onto another bark square, a faint scent of rain and rust filled the room. He propped the square on the ledge and watched. His eyelids grew heavy, not with fatigue alone, but with the hypnotic cadence of the forest. The endless birdsong, the sighing leaves, the low croak of a distant toad. By late afternoon, the image began to emerge. A tree, but not any tree he recognized. Its trunk bent unnaturally, coiling like a serpent, and its branches ended in sharp points, almost like spears. He shivered despite the warmth in the cabin. This wasn't a memory he owned. Someone or something had loaned it to him. He stepped outside to clear his mind. A deer stood at the edge of the clearing, watching him with a calm, unblinking gaze. Its fur shone golden in the slanting sun, and for one whimsical moment, he wondered if the forest was sending envoys now, not just silent strangers. The deer flicked its ears and bounded away, leaving the alchemist alone with the damp smell of earth and the buzz of gnats. That evening, as he arranged the 3 bark squares in a row, he realized the progression. First, rivers; second, an eye; now a tree, water, perception, and root. A sequence, a language. He whispered to himself, I think I can almost hear you. The forest, patient and unhurried, seemed to hold its breath. Far above, an owl called, soft and questioning. He couldn't tell if it was warning him to stop or urging him to go further. He thought of the hooded figure again, and the unspoken invitation that single bloodstone carried. As he blew out the candle, the room sank into velvet darkness. He lay in bed, aware of every creak in the timbers, every brush of wind against the shutters. Sleep came like a tide pulling him under, but the last thing he sensed was the faint metallic taste on his tongue, as if the bloodstone had dissolved into him completely. leaving iron and fire to swirl where dreams should be. The next morning brought a fog that clung low to the forest floor, thick enough to blur the edges of trees into ghostly silhouettes. The alchemist opened his cabin door and inhaled the damp air, catching the scent of wet moss and wood smoke from his own chimney. He felt suspended between worlds, half in the realm of waking, half still trapped in the undercurrent of his dreams, where iron swam through veins like molten rivers, and the forest whispered in a language he could almost understand. He moved slowly through his routine, crushing dried rosemary and fennel seeds with a mortar and pestle, the rhythmic grinding oddly comforting. A quirky note from his studies rose to the surface of his thoughts. Medieval healers once believed that rosemary under the pillow could repel evil spirits, while fennel hung in doorways discouraged wandering ghosts. Historians still argue whether these practices were rooted in old Roman superstition or practical attempts to mask the ever-present smell of decay in rural life. Either way, his little cabin smelled fresher than it had in weeks. After eating a heel of bread dipped in weak honey tea, he returned to the bark squares. In the daylight, the third square, the twisted tree, looked sharper, as if the wood fibers themselves had rearranged overnight to better reveal the vision. He traced the branch-like shapes with his fingertip, wondering again whose memory he was holding. Perhaps it was the hooded figures, or perhaps the forest itself, ancient and self-aware in some inexplicable way, was letting him borrow a sliver of its own recollection. He decided to test his growing theory if blood truly carried memory, then mixing it with elements of the forest might reveal the past lives of both man and land. He carried a small knife, the bloodstone, and a clean cup to the stream again. Mist hovered above the water, muting the sun into a pale disk. He pricked his thumb with practiced efficiency and let the drop fall. This time, he added not bark, but a small handful of wet clay scooped from the stream bed. The water turned cloudy, and when he stirred it with a twig, faint streaks of red swirled like smoke trapped in liquid. He stared, half expecting a face to form, but the clay remained stubbornly opaque. Frustrated, he carried the cup back to his cabin and poured the mixture over a sheet of bark. Hours passed. He tended the fire, mended a frayed strap on his satchel, and even napped in a chair. When he awoke, his back stiff, the bark had begun to change color, an ashy grey with faint red filigree. Slowly an image emerged, a figure kneeling beside a mound of stones, hands pressed to the ground. A thrill shot through him. It was not him. This was someone older, wrapped in rough furs, hair wild, face half obscured. He looked like he belonged to the forest, and the way his palms met the earth suggested reverence or surrender. The alchemist felt a tug in his chest, a pulse of empathy for this ghost of another time. Perhaps this was how memory wanted to travel, through blood, through mud, through the quiet persistence of wood and stone. As evening approached, he wrapped the new bark square and tucked it with the others. He needed guidance. That night, he sat by his window, candlelight trembling, and whispered into the forest, "If you can hear me, send another sign." He felt foolish speaking aloud, but the hush of the misted woods seemed to lean closer, as if listening. An owl answered again, 3 short hoots. He thought he saw movement at the tree line, a shadow heavier than the rest of the night, but when he blinked, it dissolved back into the fog. Maybe the hooded figure was always watching, maybe they wanted him to keep going, or maybe they were waiting for him to falter. He shivered, drew his blanket tighter, and let his mind drift toward the strange image on the bark. In the quiet that followed, he realized the forest no longer felt like a backdrop to his life. It had become a participant, a co-author, and perhaps a judge. He fell asleep with that thought, and the iron taste returned to his tongue, as if to remind him that memory was not always gentle. It could also be sharp as a blade. Morning broke with the forest glistening under a thin veil of dew. The alchemist woke to the creak of his roof timbers as the sunlight warmed the cabin, and for a moment he forgot about the blood-etched bark squares resting in his satchel. He stretched, hearing his spine pop like a bundle of twigs, and shuffled to the window. Outside, the mist had finally cleared, revealing the stream sparkling as if it had been polished overnight. A jay swooped down, squawking in protest at some unseen rival, then vanished into the canopy. He set about his morning ritual with the same mixture of weariness and anticipation he had felt the last several days: bread, honey water, a smudge of ash across his fingers to remind himself of fire's patience. He examined the bark squares again, laying them out on the table like a strange tarot spread: the hand, the hooded figure, the twisted tree, the kneeling man. Each one hummed with its own silent resonance, and he wondered if he was slowly piecing together a story the forest had buried for centuries. Historians still argue whether medieval alchemists truly believed in the consciousness of nature, or if those accounts were romantic embellishments added by later storytellers. But he could feel it now. If the forest wasn't conscious, it was doing an excellent impression. He decided that if he wanted clearer visions, he needed a catalyst beyond clay and bark. He rummaged through his shelves until he found a small vial of powdered hematite. Once, in the city, a passing merchant had told him hematite carried the memory of the earth's heart and could amplify any ritual tied to blood. The merchant had also been selling weasel skulls as guaranteed ghost deterrents, so the alchemist had laughed him off at the time. Yet here he was, grinding the glittering powder into a fresh wooden cup with a few drops of his own blood. The result was mesmerizing. The liquid shimmered dark red, almost metallic. He carried the cup outside and crouched near the stream, setting the cup on a flat stone to let sunlight touch the mixture. He whispered, "Show me what you've hidden," feeling absurd, yet also profoundly present. A dragonfly landed on the rim for a moment, then darted off. Ripples spread across the surface, though no wind stirred. The image that bloomed this time was immediate and startling: fire racing across the forest floor, consuming dry leaves and licking at the base of towering pines. In the vision, shadows moved, people perhaps, darting among the trees with buckets and crude tools, trying to smother the flames. One figure turned toward him through the rippling surface, a young woman, face streaked with soot, eyes wide with fear and determination. She mouthed something he couldn't hear, and then the image shattered into meaningless reflections. He staggered back, heart pounding. The sensation that followed wasn't fear exactly, but a heavy awe, like he'd accidentally eavesdropped on the heartbeat of the past. He sat in the moss, fingers curling into the damp earth, trying to shake off the tingling in his arms. He thought of the real fires that had swept through medieval forests, common during drought years when villagers cleared land for charcoal or fields. A single spark from a cooking hearth could doom an entire hamlet. The forest seemed alive with memory now. Birds chattered overhead, a woodpecker hammered rhythmically at a dead trunk, and somewhere in the distance a fox barked. Even the mundane details of the day felt like whispers from another time. He returned to the cabin and etched the new vision into another bark square: streaks for fire, swirls for smoke, and the faint outline of a woman's face. As night approached, he decided to honor the vision with a candle-lit vigil. He lined up all 5 bark squares on the table, lit 3 beeswax candles, and let the flames cast long shadows over the tiny forest inside his home. "What do you want me to see next?" he asked the empty room. A soft knock startled him. He froze. No one ever came this deep into the woods, uninvited. Slowly he rose and opened the door. There was no one there, but on the threshold lay a single pine cone, perfectly balanced, with a streak of dried red across its scales. Whether it was animal blood or something stranger, he couldn't tell. He bent to pick it up, half expecting it to vanish. The pine cone was real, rough under his fingers, and warm, as if it had been sitting in the sun rather than the evening chill. He whispered to himself, "Message received," and shut the door. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't help replaying the vision of fire and the girl's silent plea. He wondered if the hooded figure and the pine cone were guiding him towards something buried in the history of the land, something that could burn as fiercely as it could remember. Sleep came slowly, full of flickering orange light behind his eyelids. The next morning, the alchemist awoke with a throbbing in his fingertips, the faint pulse of blood that felt almost too loud in the quiet of his cabin. He stared at the pine cone on the table, the streak of dried red now cracked and flaking, and he wondered if he should burn it or bury it. In his experience, talismans that appeared uninvited usually had rules, and breaking those rules never ended well. But curiosity always outweighed caution in his life. which is probably why he was living alone in a forest surrounded by jars of weird things. He took the pine cone outside, holding it like a sacred relic, and followed the stream deeper into the woods. He had never gone this far beyond his regular foraging paths. The canopy thickened, blotting out much of the sun, and the moss beneath his boots grew denser, springing back from his every step. He could hear water gurgling somewhere ahead, birds were quieter here, and even the wind seemed hesitant to stir the branches. Medieval woods were often described as cathedrals of fear, and as he stood among the trunks, he finally understood the phrase. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers genuinely believed forests were haunted, or if it was a metaphor for the danger of wolves, outlaws, and the unknown. In this moment, he leaned toward the haunted theory. He reached a clearing he had never seen before, where the stream pooled into a small mirror-still pond. The reflection of the trees above made it look like a window into a second forest upside down. He knelt at the edge, clutching the pine cone, and whispered, "All right, show me why you brought me here." He tossed the pine cone into the water. Instead of floating like he expected, it sank immediately, spinning slowly as it descended. The surface rippled, and the reflection bent until it revealed a scene not his own. He saw the girl from the fire again, this time carrying a bundle of scrolls through the woods, her arms shaking from the weight. Behind her, a group of rough men in leather and chain pursued, torches raised. She tripped, the scrolls scattering, and he watched in horror as a torch fell into the underbrush. Flames erupted as though the forest had been waiting for this moment. The vision jolted him back to the present. He fell onto his hands, breathing hard, his palms sinking into mud. He realized the pine cone hadn't bobbed back to the surface. It was simply gone, swallowed by the memory pond. He thought of the historical fact he once read during the 13th century. Forests often served as hiding places for dissidents or rebels, and some even stored illegal manuscripts that contradicted the church. Perhaps these woods had been one of those sanctuaries. Perhaps the blood that carried iron and fire, the blood he'd been offering, was unlocking not gold but secrets long drowned by time. A splash interrupted his thoughts. A small frog had leapt into the pond, sending lazy ripples across its surface. This mundane intrusion reminded him that life carried on, and perhaps the forest wasn't entirely malevolent, it simply remembered. He decided to honor the vision in the only way he knew, by recreating the girl's burden. Back at the cabin, he rummaged for parchment scraps and bound them together with twine into a crude bundle. He carried them to his table, placing them among his bark squares. He imagined the young woman struggling to save words while the fire closed in. He whispered to the empty room, "I won't drop them." As the candlelight flickered, he felt something new, the sense that he wasn't just witnessing these memories, but inheriting a responsibility. He thought of the quirky tidbit he had once read in a dusty book. Some medieval alchemists kept memory jars, claiming that blood from a single finger prick could preserve the knowledge of a lifetime if sealed with beeswax and prayer. Maybe his bark squares, pine cones, and cups of blood were forming his own accidental version of that practice. Night came, and the forest wind whispered against his shutters. He dreamed of fire again, but this time he walked through the blaze unharmed, carrying the girl's scrolls while unseen voices cheered from the darkness. When he awoke, his hands were clenched so tightly that his fingernails had left little crescents in his palms. A soft, metallic taste lingered on his tongue, though he hadn't bitten himself. He rose, stretched, and felt the odd certainty that the forest would soon ask for more than visions. The following day, the alchemist decided he could no longer remain a passive observer of these visions. He might be alone in the forest, yes, but now he carried a weight that didn't belong solely to him. He paced the cabin, his boots creaking on the warped planks, and considered the blood he'd offered so far. A few drops, a cut here or there, it had always been manageable, almost ritualistic. But if the forest wanted memory, and memory resided in blood, how much more would it ask? He didn't want to find out the hard way. He packed a small satchel, a knife, a vial of salt, a scrap of cheese, and a lump of honeycomb he had been saving. Honey always felt like a peace offering, and besides, medieval travelers often carried it for energy and for its healing properties. He thought of the fringe stories he once read, tales of wandering monks who claimed that bees whispered secrets of the dead to those willing to sit silently among their hives. He chuckled to himself and muttered, If I start chatting with bees, I'll know I've gone too far. He left the cabin and followed the stream back to the memory pond. The air smelled of damp leaves and distant wood smoke, though he hadn't lit a fire that day. When he reached the clearing, he knelt and sprinkled a pinch of salt into the water. For preservation, he said softly. Then he dripped 3 drops of his own blood from a shallow cut along his thumb. The surface rippled once and then stilled. Nothing happened at first. He waited, squinting at his reflection. It was only when a dragonfly skated across the surface that the water shifted again and the image changed. This time he saw the forest under snow. A small band of people, men, women, and a child, huddled around a cart. Smoke rose in the distance, too black to be from a hearth. Soldiers in dark cloaks followed behind, leaving heavy prints in the drifts. He could almost feel their breath in the winter air. One of the soldiers kicked over a basket, and pages scattered into the wind like startled birds. The alchemist shivered. He couldn't shake the notion that the forest wasn't just showing him random snapshots. It was curating its worst memories for him, reminding him that history was written in blood long before ink touched parchment. Historians still argue whether smaller rural regions truly suffered frequent manuscript purges, or if such tales were exaggerated by later romanticists. Standing in that clearing, he no longer felt the need for proof. He dipped his hands into the cold water, and for a brief moment he swore he felt hands reaching back, not threatening, just asking him to remember. He withdrew, water dripping from his fingers, and realized he was shaking. On the walk back, the forest seemed to close in around him. Branches creaked. A distant owl called, and he nearly jumped out of his skin. When he reached the cabin, he bolted the door and sat at his work table. He couldn't let these images evaporate like mist. He tore strips of bark, dipped his quill in oak gall ink, and began sketching everything he'd seen. The girl with the scrolls, the soldiers in the snow, the cart, the scattered pages. His drawings were crude but urgent. He labeled each with little notes like fire vision or snow vision, as if cataloguing someone else's life. Then he noticed something strange. The bark squares he'd drawn on the first night, where he had absent-mindedly dripped his own blood, had darkened along the veins, almost as if absorbing the inkless memory. The new, bloodless drawings remained flat, lifeless. He swallowed, considering the implications. Maybe the blood wasn't just the key to seeing these visions. Maybe it was the glue that held the memories here. He leaned back and let out a sigh that rattled the window glass. "You're turning me into a librarian of ghosts," he muttered to the forest. He reached for the honeycomb and chewed a small piece, the waxy sweetness grounding him. Outside, the wind carried a rustle that almost sounded like laughter or approval. That night, he lay awake listening to the gentle throb of his own pulse in his ears. He imagined each beat carrying a spark of iron and fire, a library of secrets written in red. He knew he wouldn't be able to stop now, not until he learned why the forest had chosen him to remember what everyone else had forgotten. Morning light broke through the canopy in fractured beams, striping the cabin floor in gold. The alchemist woke with the gritty taste of ash on his tongue, even though no fire had burned overnight. He rose stiffly, his muscles aching from tension rather than work, and stepped outside to fill his lungs with the cold, pine-scented air. The forest seemed expectant, like a classroom waiting for its reluctant student to speak. He walked down to the stream again, this time without tools, letting his boots splash through the shallows. He thought about the soldiers from the snow vision, the girl in the first vision, and the haunting realization that the forest was a living archive. His mind wandered to a mainstream historical fact he had once read in a tattered book from the Abbey Library. Bloodletting, in medieval medicine, was considered a way to rebalance the humours, a universal cure for everything from headaches to bad moods. He snorted softly at the irony. If only those medieval physicians had realized they were spilling a library of memories into the dirt. The alchemist reached a moss-slick stone and sat, letting the stream's water cool his fingers. He whispered to himself about the strange fringe tidbit he had overheard from a passing tinker years ago, that some villagers believed trees absorbed the memories of those who died under their branches, and that if one leaned against the right trunk long enough, dreams would speak in the voices of the lost. He glanced at the surrounding trunks with new suspicion. The notion no longer felt like nonsense. That afternoon, he decided to trace the edge of the forest. He needed to know whether these visions were tied only to the clearing, or if the entire woodland was a living vessel of memory. As he walked, sunlight filtered in and out, creating pools of warmth and sudden chill. Occasionally he brushed against ferns and felt a static tingle climb his arms. He told himself it was only nerves, though part of him feared the forest was taking attendance. An hour into his trek, he stumbled on the ruins of a stone wall, half swallowed by roots. It looked old enough to predate the village itself, built of rough river stones that now served as moss gardens. A hollow tree leaned against it, like a weary companion. He ran his hands along the wall, and felt an odd shiver, not of cold, but of recognition. And then, as naturally as breathing, a vision swelled behind his eyes. The stones glowed faintly, and suddenly the wall was whole again, new and proud. People bustled nearby, farmers perhaps, hauling sacks of grain. A man in a faded red tunic carved symbols into one of the stones, an emblem that the alchemist couldn't decipher. Children darted past, laughing, while a dog barked joyfully. It was so ordinary, so alive, that his chest ached. Then the scene shifted. Smoke curled over the horizon, shouting. The same dog yelped in terror, and the man in the red tunic pressed his hand to the stone, leaving a bloody smear as he fled. The vision vanished, leaving him swaying on his feet. His hand was still on the cold stone, and when he drew it back, there was no blood, but a trace of warmth lingered in his palm. He staggered to a fallen log and sat, trying to catch his breath. Historians still argue whether small forest settlements were often razed without record, or if surviving families merely moved to safer hamlets, leaving myths behind. The alchemist at that moment felt he was walking through proof that both versions were true, lives erased yet written in red for anyone willing, or cursed, to read them. When he returned to his cabin, dusk had already thickened the forest into a patchwork of shadows. He poured himself a tin cup of water and studied his hands. They trembled faintly, and he could see where his veins pulsed with quiet insistence. Every beat whispered, iron and fire, memory and burden. He unrolled his bark sketches and added a new one. The man in the red tunic, his palm pressed to the wall. He labeled it Stone Vision. That night, the forest hummed outside, like a giant beast sleeping uneasily. He imagined the wall, the trees, even the moss carrying fragments of thought, each waiting for a drop of blood to unlock its voice. He lit a single tallow candle and sat cross-legged, whispering to the flame, "I see you, I hear you, I remember." Then he snuffed the candle and let the darkness press against his eyelids. Sleep came in rolling waves, and in that sleep he dreamed of a world before the forest was a forest at all. Open fields of heather, sun-drunk bees, and the same stream running silver under a sky without smoke. He thought he saw the girl from the first vision there, older, smiling at him like an old friend. Her mouth moved, forming a word he couldn't quite catch, and he awoke to the soft patter of rain on the roof. The rain continued through morning, turning the forest paths into soft mud and filling the alchemist's clearing with the scent of wet leaves. He leaned against the cabin doorway, chewing a strip of dried apple, and watched the fog curl like pale fingers between the trees. There was something soothing about the mist, yet he could not shake the sensation that every droplet carried a whisper. He listened, heartbeat soft, until he convinced himself it was only rain pattering off the branches. By noon the rain thinned into a damp drizzle. He wrapped his old wool cloak tighter and ventured toward the stream with his satchel. Today he would collect the blood of memory in a controlled way, not by accident, not by scraped knuckles or startled cuts. He had made a little kit, a goose-quill lancet, a thumb-sized copper dish, and a narrow strip of linen to bind his finger after. His plan felt half mad and half scientific, an experiment like those described in old monastic texts on mineral extractions, where monks had once boiled urine to look for traces of gold. He sat on his familiar mossy rock, rainwater still slick across its top, and pricked his finger. The sting was brief, a bead of crimson weld, perfect and reflective. He caught it in the dish and watched the rain dilute its edge. He whispered a phrase from memory, "Iron and fire, speak to me." For a long moment, nothing happened. only the drip of rain and the low call of a wood pigeon somewhere in the mist. He almost laughed at himself, but then the drop shimmered, the world around him muffled, as if he had ducked his head under water, and a new scene rose in his mind. He was no longer at the stream, he was in a cramped, smoky room where a man hammered glowing metal on an anvil. Sparks leapt like fireflies. The man's face was smeared with soot, but the alchemist recognized the red tunic from the stone wall vision, though now it was torn, patched, and sweat-stained. He worked desperately, shaping arrowheads, muttering under his breath about needing more iron before nightfall. A child sat in the corner, hugging knees to chest, humming to drown out the hammering. Then a woman's voice called from outside, and the vision fractured into white mist. The alchemist exhaled sharply, clutching the copper dish so tightly it bent under his fingers. He noticed his heart was racing like a drum in a market square. He dipped the linen into the stream, rinsed the dish, and bound his finger. A quirky tidbit from his youth crossed his mind. Sailors once carried rabbits aboard ships and would prick their ears to test for ghost winds, believing that if the rabbit froze, an unseen presence was near. He felt like the rabbit now, quivering at forces no one else could see. Back in his cabin, he documented the experience on bark forge vision with a sketch of a hammer raised mid-swing. He also began a list of sensations: muffled hearing, racing heart, misty fade. He wanted to map a pattern, as if science could take whatever this was. Historians still argue whether alchemists truly believed they could create gold, if the practice was a form of secret chemical philosophy. If asked now, he might say it was both, a pursuit of treasure and of truths buried beneath the world's skin. That evening the rain stopped. The forest glittered with droplets that caught the last slanting sunlight. He took a cautious walk, feeling the squelch of mud under his boots, and noticed the wall again. The moss on its stones now glowed faintly in the damp. A trick of light, he told himself. But when he laid his palm on the stone where the red-tunic man had pressed his hand, warmth pulsed faintly. The forest wanted him to see, to know. Night settled in, heavy and wet. He boiled nettle tea and sipped it by the fire, trying to let the forest's whispers become a background hum instead of a clamour. He thought about the villagers who might once have lived here, about the forge, the wall, the laughter of children. He wondered if the girl and the boy in his visions were siblings. He wondered if their memories were trapped here by love, fear, or simply by the stubbornness of blood. Sleep crept in like a tide, and the cabin dimmed to darkness. In his dreams, the forest rearranged itself into a spiral path, drawing him inward. At the centre, a copper dish floated in midair, full of blood that glimmered with tiny spinning scenes. He reached out, but before he touched it, he woke with the taste of iron on his tongue. The next morning dawned with a clarity that seemed almost suspicious. Sunlight lanced through the thinning mist, and birdsong returned in scattered bursts, like musicians warming up in a half-empty theatre. The alchemist stretched stiffly beside the embers of the hearth and blinked at the brightness. For 3 days the forest had wept, and now it was all sparkle and shimmer, as if trying to pretend nothing had happened. He ran a hand through his tangled hair and muttered, "You're hiding something, aren't you?" half to the forest, half to himself. He stepped outside barefoot, wincing at the cold dew soaking into his soles. The smell of wet moss and sap was strong enough to taste. Near the cabin's edge, the stream chattered merrily, swollen from the rain, and he felt its sound press against his chest like a heartbeat. He decided he would follow the stream today, see if it led to more answers or more ghosts. A fringe tidbit he once read came to mind. In the Middle Ages, some people believed running water could wash away not only dirt, but also curses, which was why condemned criminals were sometimes walked through shallow rivers before execution. He chuckled at the memory, half expecting the stream to scold him for the comparison. He packed his satchel with his blood memory kit, some dried apricots, and a bit of charcoal for sketching. The forest path along the water was soft and treacherous, but he moved with the caution of a man balancing curiosity against the possibility of supernatural reprimand. After a short while, the stream narrowed, twisting through gnarled roots and under a moss-caked log. Beyond that log, the world seemed to change colour. The trees here were older, their bark rippling like the folds of elephant skin. Lichen formed delicate constellations, and mushrooms sprouted in clusters that reminded him of tiny medieval villages seen from above. As he crouched to inspect a particularly pale mushroom, the air shifted. It wasn't wind. It was a feeling like stepping into a room just after someone whispered a secret. He sat back on his heels, heart ticking faster. He pricked his finger. A neat bead of blood welled up, glistening against the morning light. He caught it on a shard of polished glass he had brought this time. Sept convinced himself the reflective surface might help. He whispered softly, "Show me." The forest dissolved. He was in a different room now, not the forge but a low-ceilinged hall, lit by tallow candles. The stone walls sweated moisture. A group of villagers sat around a long table, their faces lit from below like figures in a Caravaggio painting. A man in a hood spoke rapidly, slamming his palm on the table for emphasis. The alchemist couldn't hear the words. Sound was always a fickle visitor in these visions, but he felt the weight of dread. On the table lay something wrapped in cloth, faintly red at one corner. A sense of ritual hung heavy in the air. Then, as always, the vision fractured into pale mist and fell away. He sat on the damp forest floor, breathing hard. His finger throbbed, and he realized his knees were soaked. He jotted quick notes. Candle Hall, villagers, cloth bundle, dread. He also wrote, blood reacts to forest locus, not cabin. It was an attempt to make sense of rules he didn't fully understand. A scholar's instinct gnawing at a mystic experience. Historians still argue whether alchemists were true scientists or merely poetic dreamers with access to a lot of flammable liquids. Moments like this made him feel like both. He followed the stream farther until it opened into a clearing where the ground dipped, forming a shallow basin now brimming with rainwater. Frogs clung to the edges, throats pulsing like tiny bellows. He noticed a single moss-covered milestone at the clearing's center, carved with an emblem, a spiral sun. Touching it sent a chill through his palm. Not cold exactly, but alive, like a cat twitching in sleep. The sun slid lower in the sky before he realized how long he had been wandering. He returned to the cabin at dusk, feeling like the forest had rearranged his insides in some subtle way. He lit a small fire and warmed his hands, listening to the soft creak of the roof beams. Before sleep, he sketched the spiral sun with care and wondered if it matched the spinning visions in the copper dish of his dream. That night, the forest whispered through his window gaps. It didn't sound like words yet, but it was patient. He could almost sense the next memory waiting, coiled like molten metal in a crucible just before the pour. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and wet leaves as the alchemist woke to the rumble of his stomach and the steady ticking of rain on the eaves. He stayed in bed a while longer, staring at the rafters and considering the previous day's visions. That hall of villagers, the red-tinged cloth, what had it been? A secret ritual? A warning? Or just another prank from his own exhausted brain? He let out a soft laugh and said aloud, "You probably want to know this. Medieval villagers did way more secret stuff than people give them credit for." He imagined a modern audience staring back at him through the invisible lens of time, nodding sleepily. When he finally rolled out of bed, the floor was cold enough to make him wince. He lit a stub of candle and shuffled to his work table. On the table lay the sketch of the spiral sun from the clearing. He ran his finger along the drawn lines. It reminded him faintly of the labyrinth suns that appear in some medieval manuscripts, though historians still argue whether those were solar depictions, pagan holdovers, or just scribes having a bad geometry day. Either way, the symbol had sunk its hooks into his imagination. He spent the morning brewing a thin oat porridge, and then simmering a mixture of copper filings and rosemary in his smallest crucible. The fumes were sharp, metallic, and herbal, filling the cabin like a medieval apothecary. There's a fun, quirky fact about rosemary. Some medieval scholars genuinely believed it could improve memory if you wore a sprig behind your ear. He tucked a sprig behind his ear now, because why not lean into superstition when your blood is already whispering? By midday the rain had slowed, and he felt an itch to test the spiral stone again. He bundled his satchel, took a torch despite the hour, and trudged back to the clearing. The forest was so saturated that each footstep squelched. Birds tracked his progress with little squeaks and clucks from high in the wet branches. When he arrived, the shallow basin glimmered with rainwater, and tiny ripples made by frogs and the occasional falling drip from the canopy. He set the satchel down, produced his glass shard, and pricked his finger once more. This time, he held the droplet above the spiral stone before letting it fall. The moment it touched, the world bent inward. He was back in the candle hall. Only now he stood at the table, peering down at the cloth bundle. When his fingers brushed the corner, the fabric seemed to fall away on its own, revealing a small iron ingot scorched black at the edges. It glowed faintly, as though holding a coal deep inside. Around him, the villagers' faces blurred, and he actually heard a single word: remember. The vision spat him out, as if the forest itself had said, "That's enough." He stumbled backward into the mud, heart racing. His knees shook as he caught his breath, trying to cling to that one audible word: memory, of course. The forest had been trying to tell him all along, blood doesn't hold gold, it holds the memory of fire and iron, of actions done and secrets buried. He sat for a long while, letting the frogs and distant drips fill the silence. He thought about the iron ingot and realized he had seen something like it in an old illustration of bog iron extraction, a process medieval people sometimes used when no proper mines were nearby. Swamps and wetlands could yield reddish nodules that, after smelting, became low-quality iron. He muttered, "Maybe that's what your blood remembers, fire and mud." By the time he trudged back to his cabin, twilight was curling through the trees. He was exhausted but also buzzing, like someone who had finally found a loose thread in a very old tapestry. He dried his boots by the fire, wrote down every detail of the vision, and even drew the ingot with the faint glow. His last note of the evening read, "If this forest keeps speaking, I have to decide, do I listen or do I leave?" He didn't fall asleep quickly. The rain started again, softer this time, and somewhere in the night, he thought he heard the forest murmur that single word once more. By dawn, the alchemist's hands trembled with both fatigue and anticipation. He had slept in broken snatches, listening to rain, to the occasional knock of a branch against his shutters, and to that phantom whisper threading through his thoughts. Remember, when he finally swung his legs out of bed, his boots were still damp from the day before, and his cabin smelled like the marriage of wet wool and iron filings. He gave a low, self-deprecating chuckle. You probably want to know this: medieval cabins weren't glamorous. They were basically glorified smell collectors. He spent the first hour chewing on dried apples and scribbling through his journal pages. The sketches of the spiral stone, the glowing ingot, and the blur of villagers stared back at him. He traced the iron ingot with his fingertip, imagining the heat radiating off it, and wondered if the memory was from the land itself or from someone who once bled here centuries ago. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed landscapes could store memory, or if that was later folklore layered atop practical superstition. Either way, the forest seemed to know things no living neighbor did. As the morning mist curled across the clearing, he packed his satchel with a small hammer, chisel, flask of water, and the glass shard for bloodletting. This time, he also brought a small iron nail he had forged weeks ago, a charm, or maybe an experiment. Walking toward the spiral stone, the forest felt different. The rain had washed everything clean, and the air carried the wet metal smell of iron-rich soil. He had read that certain bogs and wetlands in Europe produced such smells naturally, hinting at iron deposits below. He wondered if that was part of the secret, blood-remembering earth that had once bled iron into human hands. When he reached the clearing, the spiral stone glimmered with pooled rainwater. Frogs plopped away, and a pair of crows watched him from a branch, heads cocked like tiny hooded judges. He knelt and gently poured the water out of the spiral grooves, revealing the etched paths once more. With his hammer and chisel, he carefully tapped at the stone's edge, half expecting it to scream or shift. Instead, a thin chip flaked off, revealing a reddish mineral vein beneath. He rubbed it with his thumb, gritty, metallic, and faintly staining his skin. "This," he whispered, "is why the blood knows iron." Quirky fact time: medieval alchemists sometimes tasted metals or licked stones to sense their nature, which, in hindsight, sounds like the fastest way to get lead poisoning. He didn't lick this one, but felt the old urge, like his own curiosity was a mouth. He pricked his finger again, letting a drop of blood fall onto the newly exposed reddish vein. Instantly the world tilted. His ears filled with a muffled roar, and he was elsewhere. Smoke rose from a primitive smelting pit. Villagers in coarse tunics fed peat and wood into the fire while a small lump of ore glowed faintly amid the coals. Sparks spat upward, illuminating mud-smeared faces. A boy, maybe 10 years old, watched from the edge, his wide eyes reflecting fire. The alchemist realized this was the first forging of the glowing ingot he had seen before. He smelled the peat smoke and damp earth so clearly that his own cabin felt like a faded dream. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the vision wavered. The villagers froze mid-motion. The boy turned his head and looked directly at him. No, through him, and mouthed the same word as before. Remember. He jerked back into the present, sprawled on the muddy ground. His chest heaved, his finger throbbed, and the iron nail in his pocket felt heavier than before. He took it out, noticing a faint, almost imaginary warmth. Could objects absorb memory too, just like blood? The notion thrilled and terrified him in equal measure. The crows cawed sharply overhead, as if punctuating his revelation. He stumbled to his feet, suddenly aware of the forest's layered noises, dripping leaves, distant woodpecker taps, and the hush of wind twisting through branches. The world felt alive with listening. By the time he trudged home, twilight painted the canopy in bruised purples. He stoked his fire, hung his damp cloak, and scrawled everything he could remember. The boy, the peat smoke, the iron's first birth. He even noted the reddish mineral, thinking maybe it was hematite, a common iron ore, though medieval people likely had no word for it beyond that which bleeds fire. Before crawling into bed, he held the iron nail up to the flickering firelight. For a heartbeat, he swore he saw a soft pulse travel along its length, like a memory running home. He whispered to no one, the blood carries iron, and the iron carries fire, and maybe the fire carries us. Sleep found him late, while the forest hummed with secrets outside, and the whisper of remember became the rhythm of his dreams. The alchemist woke to a muted grey light, and the sensation that someone had been sitting beside his bed all night, whispering into his dreams. His joints ached from yesterday's trek, and when he swung his legs over the edge, the cabin's floorboards greeted him with the damp chill of a forest that had never truly dried. He rubbed his eyes and muttered, half to himself, and half to the invisible audience he sometimes imagined perched on his rafters. You probably want to know this. Medieval mornings smelled like wet socks and smoke, not adventure and destiny. He shuffled to his workbench, where the iron nail lay in its dish like a sleeping animal. It no longer pulsed, yet he could sense a tension in it, as if it waited for a cue. He added another line to his journal. Objects hold echoes. Blood unlocks them. Iron remembers fire. The quill scratched slowly. His fingers were stiff from yesterday's cold. Outside, the forest fog thickened and droplets ran down his windowpane like patient messengers. He decided today would be the day to test his theory more broadly. If blood could awaken memory in a nail and in a stone, what about in a living tree or a tool that had known many hands? Medieval law often claimed that trees bore witness. Old English courts even used boundary oaks to mark land ownership, believing the trees themselves remembered who planted them. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or rooted in a genuine belief that the natural world carried human memory. Either way, his forest had stood long enough to be a silent library. Bundling up, he tucked the iron nail into his pocket and grabbed the glass shard. He chose a straight, narrow path through the ferns, until he reached a massive oak that seemed older than some villages. Its trunk was gnarled into halls like frozen whirlpools. He pressed his palm to the bark and whispered, "What do you remember?" A single prick of his finger, a bead of blood smeared on the rough surface, and the world lurched sideways. Suddenly, the tree wasn't just a tree, it was a stage, and centuries rippled past like a shuffled deck of cards. He saw a knight, no, a squire perhaps, tying a horse to this very trunk, muttering under his breath about losing a stirrup. A century blurred away, and now a barefoot girl clung to the oak during a thunderstorm, her hair whipping, her mouth moving in a silent prayer. Finally, the vision slowed to a man, thin, hooded, eyes sunken, burying something at the roots. The image was hazy like a wet painting, but he could make out the glint of metal before the memory dissolved. He gasped and staggered back, dizzy, heart hammering. The forest returned in layers, cawing jay, dripping leaves, his own rasping breath. Mud squelched underfoot as he steadied himself against the oak. His finger burned faintly where the blood had flowed, as if the tree had drawn some invisible thread from him. He found himself laughing softly. Well, that's one way to check the past without a library card. Determined, he knelt and scraped at the base of the tree with his chisel. After a few minutes of careful digging, he hit metal, a small rusted buckle, half eaten by time. It wasn't treasure, but it was proof that the memory he'd seen had substance. He imagined the hooded man hiding this relic, his fear or hope sealed into both the soil and the tree. Back at the cabin, he placed the buckle beside the iron nail, marveling at the way simple objects could become vessels of stories. He jotted in his journal that medieval travelers often nailed charms or offerings to trees, believing they absorbed protection or kept memories alive. He wondered if the buckle's owner had hoped the oak would remember him long after the world forgot. Night settled slowly, the forest sighing under a heavy sky. He sat before the fire, turning the buckle in his fingers, while the nail seemed to warm slightly in sympathy. He imagined the two objects whispering across centuries, their silent iron language humming in his palm. A thought came to him, sharp as the first spark in a hearth. What if blood didn't just unlock memory? What if it could stitch the present to the past, weaving his story into theirs? As he drifted to sleep, the buckle lay beneath his pillow, and he half expected to wake to a voice or a hand reaching across time. Instead, the forest kept its soft, humming counsel, and only the whisper of remember threaded through his dreams. The next morning crept in with a whispering drizzle, the kind that makes the forest smell like damp parchment and old coins. The alchemist stretched under his wool blanket, half expecting the oak to have sent him a dream reply, but nothing lingered except the faint metallic tang of memory in his mouth. He rolled out of bed, muttering to the quiet room. You know, medieval people didn't wake to alarm clocks. They woke to cows, roosters, or rain leaking onto their faces. Lucky me, I've got the last one covered. On the workbench, the iron nail and the rusty buckle waited, patient as tombstones. He stared at them while chewing a piece of hard bread, thinking about the tree's buried vision. If blood really could unlock echoes in the world, perhaps he could trace a chain of memories, following relics like breadcrumbs. His journal entry this morning was unusually giddy. Objects are a choir, blood is the conductor. To test his theory, he rummaged through a chest of odds and ends collected from the forest. Broken horseshoes, clay shards, a chipped knife blade. Most were silent when he handled them, cold and inert. He pricked his finger, dabbed a drop on the knife blade, and waited. At first nothing, then, like the slow unrolling of a scroll, he saw a hand, coarse, scarred, sharpening the blade by firelight. Another flash, the same hand dropping it in a stream, cursing, then blackness again. He blinked and exhaled. Medieval smiths believed iron carried both strength and spiritual memory, which is why swords were sometimes named, as if they were family. Historians still argue whether naming blades was ritual magic or just a way to scare your enemies with something like, "Beware, here comes Night Fang." He grinned at the thought and tucked the chipped blade into his belt. If he could follow these fragments, perhaps the forest itself would unfold like a living map. The rain had eased into a fine mist as he ventured toward the stream. Birds called in soft, hesitant notes. He felt watched, not in a sinister way, but like the trees were curious to see what he'd uncover next. Kneeling by the water, he dipped the blade, half expecting it to shiver or hum. Instead, a clear image swam up in his mind, a man slipping on wet rocks, the blade tumbling from his hand, his shout swallowed by rushing water. The memory was brief, but his eyes were drawn upstream to a bend in the river. He followed the pull. A half-hour later, his boots squelching, he found a stone outcropping where the stream formed a shallow pool. Something metallic gleamed beneath the water. He reached in and lifted a corroded ring, barely holding together. It was small, perhaps for a child or a woman, and its faint etching hinted at a story that had slept for decades. Back in the cabin, he placed the ring beside the nail and buckle. 3 artifacts, 3 whispers of lives folded into iron and soil. His journal grew fat with notes and sketches, including a wobbly diagram of a memory chain connecting objects, places, and drops of blood. He realized that his little project now resembled a secret cartography of the past, written in red ink and river mud. That night, by the fire, he wondered aloud if his own blood now carried fragments of all these borrowed lives. Could memory flow backward, as well as forward? Could he wake one day and find himself haunted by a barefoot girl clinging to a tree, or a man losing his knife in the stream? He decided to sleep with the ring under his pillow, just to see. As the forest hummed outside and the rain returned to patter on the roof, he drifted into a half-dream where dozens of voices murmured like water on stone, and one word rose above them all: remember. Morning arrived with a strange sweetness in the air, as though the rain had polished the world overnight. The alchemist stirred under his blanket, blinking at the dim grey light filtering through the shutters. His first instinct was to check under his pillow, where the small corroded ring still rested. He held it up to the window and whispered, "Well, if you have anything to say, now's the time." A faint warmth pulsed through his fingertips. He pricked his thumb, a ritual now as familiar as yawning, and let a bead of blood smear across the ring's weathered surface. The cabin fell away in a slow dissolve. Suddenly, he was walking barefoot through a meadow, tiny white flowers brushing his ankles. A woman's laughter flitted past his ears, mingled with the creak of a wooden cart. Then a jolt, the sound of a sword drawn from its sheath, followed by the crack of something breaking. The vision snapped off like a candle flame in a gust. He slumped against the workbench, panting, while the ring cooled in his palm. "Okay," he murmured. "That's new." He scribbled the fragments into his journal, noting a resemblance to the forest's meadow to the east. His stomach rumbled, and he gnawed on a hunk of cheese, thinking about how medieval travelers often carried rings or talismans to hold luck, a belief that sometimes veered into full-on superstition. Historians still argue whether these charms had roots in ancient pagan practices, or if they were just a medieval fashion statement, like saying, "My lucky ring will keep me from getting mugged by bandits." He decided to follow the memory, with the rusty ring looped on a leather cord around his neck. He trudged east through the waking forest. Sunlight lanced through the canopy, catching beads of water that sparkled like miniature lanterns. By midday, he reached the edge of a meadow he had crossed many times. But this time, everything felt charged, like stepping into a painting he'd already seen in a dream. He crouched, scanning the grass. The wild flowers were white, just as in the vision, and the air carried a faint smell of clover and wet stone. He closed his eyes and pressed the ring to his lips. Another flicker of memory surfaced, a hand, slender, pale, offering the ring to someone with a soft laugh. A shadow loomed behind them, the sudden metallic scrape of a sword again, and then the sound of something wooden breaking, perhaps the cart axle or a fence. The image blurred as fear spiked in his chest. Searching the meadow, he found no signs of a cart or any ancient struggle, but a low stone wall, half collapsed and mossy, curved along the far side. He clambered over it, following an impulse toward the tree line. There, half buried under rotting leaves, he discovered a fragment of carved wood, a wheel spoke, weathered to the color of bone. He brushed it clean with shaking hands and laughed softly. Guess that wasn't just my imagination. Carrying the spoke back to the cabin, he considered how his blood now connected him to this invisible tapestry. Each object became a key, and he was the only lock it could turn. He realized he was not simply studying history, he was walking in its bloodstream. That night, he lined up the ring, the wheel spoke, the knife blade, and the buckle like a little parade of relics. "By firelight," he whispered, "what happened to you all?" As if in reply, a gentle chill moved across the cabin, and the flames hissed low. He felt an odd tenderness for the forgotten lives curled inside these things, as if he were their librarian or caretaker. Drifting into sleep, he dreamed of hundreds of rings and nails and buttons scattered through the forest, each one carrying a pulse, each one waiting for him to listen. The next morning arrived grey and cold, with mist curling through the trees like steam from an unseen kettle. The alchemist felt a low thrum in his chest as though the forest itself were tugging at him. He lit a small fire, boiled water for tea, and stared at his collection of relics: ring, spoke, buckle, knife. His fingers tingled with anticipation, and perhaps a little dread. He thought of medieval chroniclers, the ones who claimed that iron objects could remember the hands that forged them. Historians still argue whether those tales were metaphorical or hints at genuine superstition, passed down in taverns and guild halls where apprentices whispered of nails that carried curses. He put on his boots and slipped into the morning fog, ring hanging against his chest like a heartbeat. He followed a new trail along a stream that chuckled over stones slick with moss. Birds were quiet, as if even they were waiting for something. He bent to pick up a shard of pottery half buried in the mud, a faint blue glaze still clinging to its curve. "You probably have a story too," he muttered. Pricking his thumb, he dabbed a drop of blood on the shard. The world dissolved in that now familiar ripple, leaving him standing in a dim hut, smoke stinging his eyes. A woman stirred a pot over a low fire, muttering a song in a language he didn't know. Outside, a cart rattled past on uneven wheels. Then a sharp bang, wood splintering, and shouts filled the air. He spun, but as always, he was only a passenger. The vision snapped, and he was kneeling by the stream again, the mist pressing cool fingers to his face. He held the shard tighter, shivering. Every memory seemed to orbit the same tragedy: splintered wood, steel drawn, fear saturating the air. He wondered if the forest was less a home for animals than a graveyard for human moments. Quirky stories from local folklore bubbled to mind. Villagers claimed that a ghostly cart sometimes rattled down invisible tracks at twilight, and if you listened closely, you could hear the jingle of iron harness bells. Most dismissed it as a drunk woodcutter's tale, but he felt a tremor of recognition. By midday, the fog thinned into a luminous haze. He followed the stream to where it merged with a shallow pool. There, something gleamed underwater, a brooch shaped like a curled leaf. He reached in, the cold biting his wrist, and plucked it free. Back at the cabin, he dried it carefully and traced the delicate veins etched into the metal. Another drop of blood, another pulse of warmth, and he was standing in a sunlit glade, music weaving through the air, pipes and a drum maybe, and someone laughing as they danced. For the first time, the memory wasn't only fear. He leaned back, tears prickling his eyes. The forest's history wasn't just violence and loss. There had been joy here too, fleeting but real. He wondered if his own memories might someday leak into objects, waiting for another curious soul to prick their thumb and stumble through time. That night, he placed the brooch beside the other relics and let the fire dim low. Outside, an owl hooted, and the forest exhaled mist against the window. He whispered into the quiet, "I hear you. I really do." Sleep crept up like a soft tide, and his dreams shimmered with silver brooches and mossy wheels turning in the dark. The forest had grown bolder overnight, or maybe it was just that he had finally learnt to listen. When the alchemist stepped outside, the wind twisted around his cabin like a living thing, carrying with it a bouquet of damp leaves, wet bark, and that metallic whisper he'd come to associate with hidden memories. He breathed it in deeply, letting the morning air sting his lungs. Somewhere beyond the trees, a woodpecker tapped with a rhythm that felt like a warning. He decided today he would follow the oldest trail he had seen on his first days here, the one lined with half-fallen stones that might once have been boundary markers. Old records mentioned that medieval forests were full of such markers, often blessed by monks to ward off thieves or wandering spirits. Historians still argue whether these blessings were mostly symbolic or part of a genuine fear of haunted borders. He liked imagining the monks trudging here in heavy robes, muttering Latin into the moss. As he walked, the alchemist carried the silver brooch from yesterday, fingers brushing its cool surface. He felt braver now, more curious than afraid. The path curved into a hollow where light dappled like spilled gold. There, almost hidden beneath a mat of ferns, he found the strangest object yet, a short iron key, rusted nearly to nothing. Its teeth were worn smooth, and the handle bore a faded engraving of a serpent eating its tail. "Of course you'd be here," he murmured, half laughing. Keys were invitations, or maybe dares. He pricked his thumb without hesitation, watching the drop of blood swell, then sink into the corroded iron. The vision came faster this time. He stood in a cramped storeroom, smelling hay and old leather. Someone, broad-shouldered, in a tunic streaked with soot, was fumbling with a chest, the same key clutched in his hand, a torch, guttered, throwing sparks against the walls. Then the memory shifted, skipping like a scratched record. Horses screamed, Hooves clattered, and suddenly he was outside, watching the man flee with the chest into the woods. Behind him, flames licked skyward, as if the whole village were exhaling fire. The heat brushed the alchemist's face even across centuries. When the vision snapped back, he was kneeling in the damp hollow, panting. His heart felt as if it had galloped along with that desperate thief. The forest around him was very still, almost as if it had paused to gauge his reaction. He realized then that every memory he touched was a thread in a larger tapestry: fear, flight, and the stubborn human will to carry life or treasure into the shadows. As he hiked back to the cabin, he thought of a quirky medieval superstition he'd read about once. Villagers believed iron keys could trap spirits, keeping them from wandering into houses. He chuckled softly, imagining the ghost of that fleeing man locked inside the key all this time, waiting for a listener. That night, he placed the key beside the brooch and the pottery shard, arranging them like an audience. The firelight flickered over the objects, and he whispered, "I'll remember for you." Then he lay on his cot, listening to the wind comb the treetops, each gust like a page turning in the forest's endless, unfinished book. Sleep arrived slowly, curling around him like smoke, full of iron doors and unseen chests, and he wondered if by morning the forest would reveal what the man had carried, and why it still mattered after all these years. Dawn crept over the forest in a grey, unhurried veil, softening the jagged outlines of branches and turning the wet leaves into 1,000 trembling mirrors. Mist slunk low to the ground, curling around the alchemist's cabin like a cat reluctant to leave the warmth of night. Inside, the alchemist stirred awake on his narrow cot, slower than usual, his body heavy as though the dreams he'd swum through had followed him back into the waking world and draped themselves over his shoulders. His fingers flexed as if they had been writing letters in the air while he slept. On the table by the hearth, 3 objects waited: the iron key with its tooth chipped from age, the silver and garnet brooch dulled by years of dirt, and the fragment of pottery with its uneven rim. Each glinted faintly in the half-light, not from polish or firelight, but from a presence that was less visual than sensed, a soft pressure against his thoughts. He swore they had shifted positions overnight, creeping infinitesimally closer to each other, like children who'd started as strangers and ended as conspirators in the dark. He stretched, bones popping, and stood in the muted hush of the cabin. Today, he thought, would be the day. He had touched these artifacts separately, feeding each a droplet of his own blood, unlocking visions that clung to his mind like smoke long after the fire was gone. But a question had lingered, pulsing behind his temples for nights. What if they were combined? What if their memories wanted to speak together, like verses forming a poem only when read in sequence? The forest outside hummed with rain-heavy stillness, a patient audience. He fetched a slate slab from the shelf and arranged the artifacts in a loose triangle, careful and ceremonial, as though some unseen crowd was watching. A fresh pinprick to his thumb, a bead of blood swelling like a jewel, and he let it fall to the center of the slate. The moment the drop touched, the air fractured, not with light, not with sound, but with the sensation of a string snapping inside the chest. His knees buckled, and for a heartbeat he wasn't sure whether he was standing, sitting, or scattered into mist. The cabin dissolved, colors running like watercolor in rain, and then he was elsewhere. He stood atop a grassy hill under a pale drizzle. Below stretched a medieval village, the kind he had glimpsed in fragments before: timbered houses with sagging roofs, narrow dirt lanes churned into mud, and smoke rising in frantic, uneven plumes. Bells clanged from a squat stone church, their echoes panicked and uneven, as though the ringer's arms were trembling. Villagers ran in all directions, some clutching sacks and squirming children, others lugging buckets of water that splashed to the mud before they reached the smouldering barn at the town's edge. He caught the faint sting of char and wet wool. Somewhere a horse whinnied, high and scared. This was not the triumphant memory of feasts or rituals he had half expected. This was flight, this was loss, and yet it pulsed with a strange intimacy. He could almost feel the villagers' frantic heartbeat in his own veins, the blood that carried not iron or gold, but fire and fear and memory. The vision lurched, pulling him like a current toward the forest beyond the village. He found himself standing at the mouth of a shallow cave, rain dripping from its lip. Inside, hunched like a man, cornered by his own mistakes, was the thief he had seen in flashes before, the shadowy figure from the brooch and the key. Up close, he was younger than the alchemist expected, his beard patchy, his hands trembling as they fumbled with a wooden chest. The thief's chest cavity. No, he corrected himself. The box he held open revealed not coins or chalices, but bundles of letters and tiny leather-bound books. He lifted one with the care of a man, cradling a sleeping infant. A page fluttered, and the alchemist saw crude but heartfelt illustrations. A child's face, a field of rye, a map of the forest with a heart scrawled on one tree. He understood then, these were not treasures in the way kingdoms counted treasure. These were lives, pressed into paper to outlast memory, to defy the fragile nature of human breath. Somewhere beyond the cave, a horn blared, long and low. The thief flinched, his eyes darting toward the village path. He hesitated, then clawed at the earth with bare hands, burying the chest under wet soil. His lips moved in a mutter, a prayer the alchemist could almost catch but not fully, half apology, half promise. The scene wavered, tinted with the ache of secrets and the ache of time. Historians still argue whether independent rural archives ever existed outside monastic libraries, whether ordinary folk recorded their daily lives with such devotion. Some claim that such accounts would have been lost to illiteracy and fire, dismissed as legend. But here, in the forest's blood-born testimony, the alchemist saw the proof, raw and trembling in the rain, slick hands of a desperate man. This was a memory that no textbook had ever carried, a chapter the world had let slip. The vision unraveled like wet parchment. He felt himself pulled backward, heart first, until the cave, the thief, the chest, and the mud dissolved into darkness. He slammed back into the cabin with a gasp, both hands clamped to the table to keep from toppling. His hearth spat a single ember, and outside, the rain had thickened to a gentle curtain. He sat down heavily, the wooden chair creaking in protest. "Not gold," he whispered, voice rasping in the hush. "Never gold, memory." For the first time, the weight in his chest eased. The long nights of obsession, of chasing metal and miracle, had led him to something quieter, more precious than he could have imagined. He thought of all the times he had boiled down leaves and bark, hoping to distill the philosopher's stone, believing each drop of blood might turn to gold. And now, he had distilled something far rarer, a story rescued from the jaws of forgetting. Night approached gently, like the forest itself had padded up to press its muzzle against the cabin. The alchemist lit a final candle, letting its soft light paint the objects on the table, key, brooch, shard, like relics in a private shrine. He could feel the forest outside breathing in rhythm with him, as if acknowledging his promise. He settled by the fire, blanket drawn around his shoulders, and let his voice drop to a soft, secretive cadence. "I'll remember," he said to the empty room. "I'll carry it forward." The forest outside sighed through the branches, and in that whisper of wind he thought he heard a reply, as soft as a nod. The candle burned lower. Rain pattered like a lullaby on the roof. His eyes fluttered closed, then open, then closed again, sinking into the gentle weight of exhaustion. He thought of the thief pressing letters into soil, of children whose drawings had become prayers, of the river of memory flowing invisibly under the world's feet. Iron and fire in the blood, yes, but also the quiet current of stories, waiting for someone to touch them and listen. In that deepening quiet, the last image before sleep was of the forest, unchanging and eternal, cradling its memories like seeds in rich soil. And for the first time in many months, the alchemist slept without dreams, knowing the night itself was dreaming for him. The morning did not so much arrive as it drifted into being, like a veil slowly lifting over the forest. Thin light threaded through the canopy, painting moving patterns across the alchemist's small cabin. The night's rain still clung to the world, every surface glistening, every leaf tipped with silver droplets. The air was so clean it almost hummed. Inside the cabin, the alchemist stirred from a slumber that had wrapped him in its deepest folds, the first sleep in many seasons untouched by restless visions. For a long moment, he lay still on the narrow cot, eyes half closed, letting the world whisper to him. There was the creak of timber as the cabin settled, the faint tap of water dripping from the eaves, and somewhere far off, the spiraling call of a woodlark. He felt his chest rise and fall with a slow, measured rhythm, and realized with a quiet, almost amused awareness that nothing was chasing him anymore. No phantom gold, no feverish question, no desperate need to pry open the veins of time. Eventually he sat up, letting his bare feet touch the cool wooden floor. The air smelled of damp moss and extinguished candle wax, tinged faintly with the pine resin he had burned the night before. On the table by the window rested the three artifacts: the rusted key, the tarnished brooch, and the shard of pottery whose edges were smoothed by centuries of touch and soil. They were utterly still, no longer thrumming with that invisible pull that had haunted him for so many nights. He approached them slowly, as though visiting old friends who had finally found their peace. His fingers brushed the metal of the key, and a faint warmth lingered, not the supernatural fire he had once felt, but the simple warmth of sun-kissed iron. He smiled, a soft inward curve of the mouth, and realized he no longer feared forgetting. The memories had settled where they belonged, woven into the quiet folds of his mind, ready to be carried forward without weight or urgency. The alchemist opened the door and stepped outside. The forest greeted him with a hush that was almost holy. Mist clung low to the ground, curling around the bases of the trees, and tiny beams of sunlight sliced through the vapor. He walked slowly, savoring the sensation of soft, rain-soaked earth beneath his soles. Birds flitted between branches overhead, each movement leaving a brief tremor of droplets in the air. The world seemed to breathe with him, each inhalation filling his chest with the scent of wet leaves and distant wildflowers. Down a gentle slope, the clearing opened. He paused there, letting the silence stretch until even his thoughts became languid. In this place, he had once knelt in panic, chasing visions, trying to force the earth to yield its secrets. Now he knelt again, but with a different heart. He pressed his palm to the soft soil, and the ground received him as if recognizing an old companion. Coolness seeped into his skin, and he whispered a simple promise to no one in particular: "I will remember, I will carry you quietly." There was a stillness to that vow that required nothing in return. He felt no demand, no reply, only a sense of being heard. When he rose, the forest had not changed, yet everything seemed lighter. Sunlight now stretched in wider shafts, catching motes of mist and turning them into floating gold. His shoulders eased, and a quiet, weightless joy took root in his chest. Back at the cabin, he brewed tea from dried mint and the last pinch of chamomile he had been saving. Steam curled from the cup in thin, slow spirals, and he sat by the open door, cradling the warmth in both hands. Beyond the doorway, the forest swayed with patient rhythm, leaves brushing leaves, wind combing branches. The smell of damp earth mingled with the soft bitterness of the tea, and his eyelids grew heavy with contentment rather than fatigue. Hours passed without him noticing. He let them, unbothered by the ticking of any clock. In the old days he had measured time in experiments and failures, in anxieties and near successes that slipped away like mist. Now, time moved like a river under ice, smooth, inevitable, and beautiful, because it could not be hurried. The artifacts on the windowsill glimmered faintly in the afternoon sun, not as relics of power, but as simple reminders of stories told and heard. By evening the forest deepened into blue shadow, and the first crickets began their gentle chorus. The alchemist lit a single candle and set it near the window, letting its golden glow mingle with the fading light. He imagined, briefly, that the forest could see the little flame and nod in approval. He thought of the lives that had touched this soil, the villagers, the travellers, the unknown hands that had dropped the key or worn the brooch, and he felt no sorrow for their passing. Instead, he felt gratitude that their memory had reached him, had been seen, and would quietly endure in the folds of his own days. When night came fully, he did not return to the cot immediately. He sat outside on the cabin's small step, wrapped in a woolen blanket, and looked up through the black lace of the canopy. Stars revealed themselves slowly, shy and glimmering, and the thin crescent of a moon rose just high enough to gild the mist with silver. His breathing slowed to match the world's cadence, long and unbroken. A breeze slid over the clearing, soft as a whispered farewell, and he closed his eyes, letting the forest's lullaby fold him into stillness. He thought, in that gentle half-dreaming state, that he could stay here forever and never want for anything more. He could grow old with the forest, listening, watching, remembering. Perhaps one day someone else would find his cabin, dust on the windowsill, the artifacts still glowing in the soft sun. And maybe they too would learn that some treasures are not meant to be melted or spent, but simply carried as quiet light inside the mind. At last, he returned indoors, leaving the door ajar to let the night air drift through. He lay down with the blanket tucked to his chin and listened to the forest breathing. His eyes fluttered shut, and sleep rose to meet him, not as a wave but as a tide, warm and certain. In that final moment of awareness, he felt like part of the land itself, a memory held in the soil, in the roots, in the air. And the cabin, the artifacts, the trees and the stars all seemed to agree. The story was safe now. Time would move on softly and carry him with it like a feather on a slow current. Good night. Sweet dreams.